deconstruction. Largely, deconstruction means to carefully analyze and break down something into smaller building blocks. For example, one might take an entire Lego structure and then reduce it to its individual Lego pieces. So there are two components to deconstruction, philosophical and literary. And the aim of deconstruction is to expose the binary or dialectic or dualist modes of thinking that exist in any given text. For example, dark versus light, rain versus sun, attending sociology class versus sleeping, etc. These are all the underlying contradictions that underpin most of these social facts. This can be sort of related to the concept of negative space in art, or what is expressed minus what is not expressed. For example, if the male role is created in society, certain masculine traits are specified. What is feminine then is defined as everything masculinity is not. For example, if we look at Disney cartoons, we tend to see the Prince Charming as a stereotype, and the princess is always the opposite of what Prince Charming is supposed to be. Some even say that to be a Disney princess, one has to be helpless and rely on the prince to save them. In earlier Disney films, perhaps that's what some critics said. Now, of course, in the latest Disney films, you might not see that dualism anymore. So based on this dualism, social constructs are created, again like in gender roles. And the fear regarding postmodern theories' challenge to sociology is whether it is essentially deconstructing sociology itself. So even sociology, which aims to deconstruct society, it too can be deconstructed. Next, we come on to Lyotard, a postmodern theorist, who compared the status of knowledge and how it is valued in modern versus postmodern societies. So postmodern theory also attacks sociology for its claim of being able to produce a so-called specialist knowledge, a so-called ontology, and having its own epistemology. So Lyotard inspired the creation of something called postmodern sociology. For Lyotard, even when the European Enlightenment people criticized the concept of religious systems and replaced it with science, he was interested to know what were the mechanisms that led people to eventually embrace science. Society still underwent the same processes of accepting science as a new major belief system, also called the meta-narrative. So what the postmodern sociology theorists did was that they took Lyotard's criticism and developed it into a critique of sociology's own meta-narrative, where sociologists produce expert knowledge to improve society, just like Durkheim, Parsons, and the other structural functionalists, for example. And they felt that general theories are no longer sufficient to explain this increasingly fragmented social world. So now we'll come to what the postmodernists think. The first is Frederick Jameson, who believed that postmodernity is a depthless, superficial world, because it is a world of simulation, and that there is a loss of sense of one's place in history, because even time and space has now broken down and are no longer obstacles. Therefore, it would be hard to distinguish past, present, and future. And postmodernity would therefore be dominated by implosive, flattening, reproductive technologies. Next on, we have Rosenau, who believed that the postmodern mode of thought is defined in terms of the things that it opposes. So everything is relative, which are mainly characteristics of the modern way of thinking. And these reject the grand narratives that characterize much of classical sociological theory. Instead, they prefer more limited explanations, or even no explanations at all. Everything is taken as it is. So there was a rejection of boundaries between disciplines, hence even the discipline of sociological theory becomes irrelevant. This focuses on more peripheral aspects of society rather than the core of society. So in other words, it becomes rather superficial. Now, then, what do the modernists, or those who still believe that modernity is still existing, what do they say? First of all, we come back to Anthony Giddens, the theorist of structuration. He's also known as the high priest of modernity because he uses terms like radical, high, or late modernity to describe current society, and insists that we are still living in the later stage of modernity. Modernity, of course, is, as you recall, it's defined by the fact that we have moved towards science as a dominant mode of thinking and of production. So he indicates that while today's society is not the same one as the one described by classical theorists in the start of the first industrial revolution, yet it is really a continuation of that period, but just intensified. So he describes present modernity as a juggernaut that is out of control. And we also have Beck, who characterizes the emerging new society as a risk society, because today everything is about avoiding risk and having risk management. While the classical dilemma in classical modernity was about redistribution of wealth and inequality, the current dilemma is the management of risk, like nuclear accidents. Meanwhile, for Habermas, he believed that modernity is an unfinished project. It's a work in progress. And the central issue in the modern world is still rationality, just like in Weber's time. The main problem here is to maximize rationality in the system or society and in the life world, which is the individual scope of interaction. And this view is supported by RERE, who came up with the term McDonaldization. So what RERE did was to continue Weber's focus on the problem of increase in formal rationality and the danger of an iron cage of rationality. That is to say, when rationality governs everything to the point that people become so calculative, they no longer have the creativity to think for themselves. RERE used the term McDonaldization of society because the fast food restaurant represents contemporary paradigm of formal rationality. There are 4 dimensions of formal rationality: efficiency, predictability, quantity over quality, and the substitution of non-human for human technologies. This means that, just like the 4th Industrial Revolution today, we will all eventually be replaced by machines because they are the most efficient and calculative. So, since postmodern theory criticizes sociology, so sociology criticizes it back. What do the sociologists say about postmodern theory? So they say that postmodern theory contradicts itself because it says that sociology makes generalizations, but so does postmodern theory. After all, it makes claims like all of Western society has shifted from modernity to postmodernity. That's a very general statement. And also, the sociologists say that postmodernists select evidence because they have ignored many other evidences that the modern age still exists. For example, the problems of modernity still exist, whereby you have a distinction between the rich and the poor, bureaucracy, the iron cage of rationality, and all these things. And number 3, they say that things like time-space compression, whereby time and space are no longer obstacles to human beings. Well, this only applies to those in the middle classes or the elite, as only they can afford to continually change identities. And they also assert that postmodernists are anti-empiricists because they say that anything is relative and we don't really need evidence. So, postmodernists believe that there is a true knowledge out there. But this is not really new because Weber himself too was ideographic rather than nomothetic. And so were the realists, who believed that every single observation is unique. So these are how the sociologists have responded to the critiques made by the postmodern theorists towards sociology. Okay then, so if postmodern sociology doesn't work, how about sociology of postmodernity? We could assume, for example, that to a certain extent, there is some postmodernity happening in some parts of the world. As for the rest of the world, especially where they are economically disadvantaged, it is either still in modernity or not even there yet. So, could we then create a special sociological theory to study that part of the world in which postmodernity exists? Perhaps, perhaps not. So in conclusion, it would be rather unfair to say that postmodern theory has not a single contribution. In fact, it has. Number 1, it provided a new way of looking at culture and identity. Number 2, it provided a new way of looking at the mass media and the effects of living in a mass-mediated society, also known as hyper-reality, if we were to take the works of Baudrillard. And finally, it raised important critical questions about sociology's most critical concepts.